Hey guys, thanks for joining me again for another episode of my YouTube channel, Long Live the Brains. Last week I was talking about medical genetics and the question that I get asked frequently, which is this disease genetic? And what I've learned is that what I'm usually being asked is, okay, my parents have the disease, what are the chances that I develop it? Or I have the disease, and what are the chances that my children develop it? These are great questions, and sometimes I'm able to give a pretty straight, short answer, but as our understanding of medical genetics increases, the answer to this question becomes increasingly complex. So last week, I was talking about two forms of Mendelian inheritance that are kind of the most straightforward, one being autosomal dominant, and that essentially means that if your parent has the disease, you've got a 50% chance of developing the disease. Then autosomal recessive gets a little bit more complex, and then there are other forms of inheritance that I didn't talk about, X-linked, X-linked recessive, mitochondrial types of inheritance. Those get more complicated and are a little bit out of the scope of this, but what I want to touch on is in direct response to some of the great questions and comments that you guys have posted over the past week, asking about, my family member has these diseases. There are a few people in my family with these diseases. We don't have a clear-cut, inheritance pattern. Some of these diseases, autoimmune, whatever the case may be, seem to run together. What's the explanation behind this? And unfortunately, it's a very complex answer, and it's an incomplete answer, at least, as of January of 2019. So I'm going to use Alzheimer's disease as an example of how our understanding of medical genetics has progressed, and also to talk specifically about the disease and what these inheritance patterns look like. Okay, so I'm going to use a figure from a publication from 2017. The citation's at the bottom of this slide that I've made. And so I'll draw your attention to the top left part of the figure. And we have three genes, so the presenilin 2, the APP, and presenilin 1 genes. Now these genetic mutations in these diseases are pretty uncommon. Okay, and that's a good thing because they are associated with a Mendelian form of inheritance. In fact, they're autosomal dominant mutations. So that means if your parents have one of these mutations, then you've got a 50% chance of developing the disease. The good news is, again, is that these are rare, and they account for less than 1% of all Alzheimer's disease. Okay, so that's very good. Those people that have mutations in one of these three genes tend to develop Alzheimer's disease at an earlier age. So you may hear the term early onset Alzheimer's disease. We're really talking about Alzheimer's disease that develops at the age less than 65. Okay, so less than 65 years old. All right, so let's move down and to the right in this graph. And I'll draw your attention to the ApoE4. So ApoE is a gene. And remember, we all have two copies of each gene. We call those copies alleles. So you can have one allele of the ApoE, that's ApoE4, and that results in an increased risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. You could also have two ApoE4 alleles, and that would result in even more risk for Alzheimer's disease. Now, these don't result in as high a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease as the presenilin 1, 2, and APP, but they do result in increased risk. And they are found in the population with a higher prevalence than APP, presenilin 1, and presenilin 2. Okay? But they are not as common as the bottom right category, the common variants. Okay? Now the good news is, while these common variants are common, each one of them as an individual confers a relatively small degree of risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. However, what we are learning though is it appears that if you have mutations in more than one of these, that it's associated with a greater risk. Okay, but again, each one as an individual is a small amount of risk. Okay, so Alzheimer's disease, it's a good example to kind of illustrate that what we used to think was the whole of medical genetics, that being these simple Mendelian inheritance patterns, has gotten much more complicated. And the good news is genes with mutations in them, for the most part in these common variants, result in a smaller degree of risk, but they're out there. So hope this answers some of the questions that you guys have. Don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the notification buttons, that's the little bell in the YouTube app, so that you'll be notified every time that I post a new video. Share these with friends, families, have conversations about these illnesses, about the state of science. The more awareness that we have about these diseases, the fact that we don't have great treatments, the fact that we don't have cures, that should drive these discussions. And it's through education of the public as a whole that we can begin to move forward and really start to bat these diseases down.